we arranged that I should introduce you, Kate, but I was so busy that I nearly forgot it. But so I didn't read your CV, but I know enough of you to introduce you. And maybe everyone knows enough of you. Kate Rudy. Positively, of course. Kate Rudy, professor at St. Andrews with a lot of experience in many institutions, and I think one of the most original people working on medieval manuscripts with always new ideas, new views on how to do the research. And I very well remember the first time you told me about the dirt in the manuscripts. And well, that's one of the things you're going to tell us about, but also about rubrics or cut in miniatures in other manuscripts, all signs of wear, of use, of the fact that books were not in the first place were objects of art, but were objects that were in use and played a role in the personal lives of people, form a central part in your research, which you, as far as I follow your roads, you not only do it in St. Andrews, but on several places in the world, and this year at the NIAS in Amsterdam. And I'm very glad you're here. The floor is to you.
Thanks. Terrific. Now, considering that this manuscript is thrilling enough to warrant an entire exhibition plus a multi-day conference, we can see that it is something spectacularly special. So I'm very grateful to the organizers, especially to Johan and to Miranda, for inviting me to this splendid event. And we're here to discuss a manuscript that conforms to some of our modern desires, an exquisitely crafted object with a plethora of images connected to someone whom we can name. And that's really important, to be able to name people in the past and then connect them to physical things. And we want to get closer to Mary through the book that she owned and most certainly touched. We get the sense that the prayer book itself formed part of her identity. And in fact, the prayer book, together with the fluttering angels, serves as an attribute in this full-page miniature. Now, the prayer book of Mary of Guelders sits among several other precious manuscripts made for noble women who have themselves pictured in their books. As part, everybody okay? Good. As part of the idealized female portrait, Mary of Burgundy on the left holds her book in a cloth, preciously carrying it out through the medium of this textile and only sort of touching it with one tapered finger and the little pinky sticking up. So part of the ethos of noble femininity was to exert oneself with this decorum with books, the strong preference to keep them clean, to use them gingerly, to demonstrate one's piety by touching them as if they were almost like a relic, to handle them only at the edges. And indeed, Kathryn of Cleves is likewise shown holding her book, also through a cloth and very, very gingerly. And it would appear that Kathryn did in fact only touch her book sparingly, and she seemed not to have left any fingerprints in her book at all. And so here is an opening from the Hours of Kathryn of Cleves in New York, where neither the patron nor anyone else has really obviously used this manuscript vigorously at all. The paint is in pristine condition, and there are no obvious fingerprints in the margins. And this incredible rupture in the page is entirely fictive. the only place in the Hours of Kathryn of Cleves where I have observed any staining at all was here at prime of the Hours of the Virgin, where you can see in the gutter here some dark stains which may be the drippings of candle wax, which would be funny because this is a page that has marginal images of beehives, so it's rather the image coming to life in the form of wax. Now, it seems that Mary of Guelders may have also possibly read her book by candlelight, according to these rather telling stains on the edges of this page. This text represents Vespers for Christmas Eve. And if wax were in fact dripped here, maybe wax dripped on the side of the book here, and then when the book is closed, the wax sticks to the opposite side. Now, by noting this kind of damage, we can begin to build a narrative about how an early user actually prayed from this manuscript on Christmas Eve, of course, one of the darkest nights of the year, which would be interesting because now we can begin imagining how an early owner, quite possibly Mary herself, used this manuscript by holding a candle precariously over the book and dripping it at this point. Now, uniquely among these manuscript prayer books made for noble ladies, the prayer book of Mary of Guelders confronts us with numerous very filthy pages. Extensive grime appears on both the original and the added parts of the manuscript. Now, I have argued in the past that dirt rubbed into the pages of a book can help reveal which parts of the book were read, and conversely, the pristine pages can show which parts of the book were largely ignored. So in today's talk, I want to apply some of that thinking to the prayer book of Mary of Guelders and ask, which parts did the early reader, quite possibly Mary herself, interact with? Which parts did she consider most important, and how did she engage with this book physically? Now, in my current work, I've been distinguishing between two major kinds of degradation, and along with it, narratives about how that degradation might have taken place. So the big idea is that patterns of wear can reveal how users used books, and that different kinds of streaks and dirt and degradation reveal different forms of handling. And broadly speaking, I think one can speak of targeted wear versus inadvertent wear. Now, the former, I believe, is present here at this prayer to the sacrament. And we can see in this lower corner this large area of degradation. And I think that someone, presumably an owner who felt a kind of privileged position with this book, somebody who felt incredibly physically present with it and had the right to use it in this very physical way, has touched her lips with her finger and touched then the corner of the page and drawn it out into the margin in order to make contact with the book, as if to bring the breath close to the manuscript, to the Word of God. Now, this kind of activity is something we can see in many books once we start looking for it. It appears all over the place. So, for example, just two examples that make this clear. In the Book of Hours at the upper left is an image from made by one of the more direct masters, and this shows Christ carrying the cross. And as you can see, his face has been wet touched, as I call it. So somebody has touched the finger to the tongue and then kissed the image using the medium of the finger to transport the kiss between the mouth and the book. And you can see that it's very clearly a finger because the wetness of the saliva has caused the paint to liquefy, and then that paint has stuck to the finger and has squished out like a kind of printing squash and left the whorls of the fingerprint across Christ's face and across his halo. And likewise, in this missal, for the use of Chartres, 14th century, it's in the Bodleian, the te igitur, which is often signaled in a missal with a full-page image of Christ crucified that would normally be brought to the priest's lips to be kissed. But instead, this book doesn't happen to have a full-page miniature. So in place of that, the user, in this case the priest, has used the next best thing available to perform his kiss, and that is, in fact, the initial, which is the T for the te igitur. And you can, there's a big drop there. Don't step there. Don't get too close to the book. Yeah. So the priest has kissed his finger, and you can see, again, the whorls of his fingerprint. And this is a kind of action that he has repeated over and over again. And using the border decoration in this way as well to make contact with the book. So it seems as if part of the function of border decoration can be to receive the physical attention, sometimes the moist attentions of the reader over a prolonged period of time in order to ritualize the reading experience. So Mary of Guelders, or an early user, seems to have done a similar ritual action here that she's played out on the page in this text. Now, the other kind of wear that I want to talk about is it involves the grime that rubs off on a page as a byproduct of handling them over an extended period of readings. This is inadvertent wear. And this occurs at the bottom corners of manuscripts where people would hold an octavo-size book in order to keep it open. And oftentimes, if the binding is sort of medium tight, it has to be held open continuously, and that continuous holding at the bottoms of the pages is something that releases finger juice, dirt, grime, etc., and rubs it into the page. There are all kinds of factors that affect how dark the page might get, including the shininess of the page. If it's very velvety parchment, the velvet fibers grab the dirt a little bit more. If the person has very sweaty palms, you can sometimes see the sort of sweat digging in to the book a bit. But we can see, for example, in this manuscript, a Delft manuscript from around 1440, that this kind of grime is really rubbed into these 6 different openings from the book, and that grime is rubbed in at different rates. So that here at the, not getting too close, the suffrage to St. Sebastian has this incredible amount of dirt here, whereas the Ursula image above has much less dirt. And the Hours of the Virgin, prefaced by the Annunciation, is quite dirty, and the Hours of the Cross significantly less dirty. And I wanted to find a way to take these words, more than, less than, a little bit more than, and so forth, and extremely filthy, and try to throw some numbers at them. And so the tool that became useful for metrifying this kind of damage was the densitometer. The densitometer is a device that measures the optical density of a reflecting surface. And it works on a logarithmic scale, and the way I used it was to zero the scale at the top of the page where the book wouldn't be handled, and that would provide a baseline, a 0, and then take a reading from the juiciest part of the fingerprint at the bottom of the page, log all of those data into a spreadsheet, and then spit out a chart like this one, which is the chart for this particular Delft Book of Hours. And it shows, for example, that the largest part of the curve, the largest area under the curve, corresponds to the Hours of the Virgin, where the reader has read the Hours of the Virgin and then fallen asleep about a third of the time before reaching complete. And that the person read the Hours of the Virgin much more frequently than the Hours of the Cross, which is way down here. And that we have lots of spikes in the suffrages, in particular spikes at the suffrage to St. Sebastian as you can predict from the very thickness of that dark fingerprint, and also a lot of activity at the prayer to the personal angel. And those correspond to those big spikes. Now, what's interesting about this technique is that, you can use it on all kinds of manuscripts. Here is another example just to show you a sense of variety of use. This is a manuscript probably made in Mechelen around 1500. And what I noticed here is that there seem to be two different spots of wear, one in the lower area of the margin and one in the corner. And so I measured both of those. And when I did so, I got two graphs that simply reiterated each other at different amplitude, which suggests that the person is holding the book open with two fingers, a thumb here, and then a middle finger here to hold the book open in a comfortable way. And so what's interesting here, though, is that we have a totally different kind of graph from in the little Delft hours. And here, the person is mostly interested in the penitential psalms, however, has no interest at all in the litany at the end of the psalms, which is quite different because lots of readers, it turns out, love lists and just read the litany over and over again. But this person is not interested in the litany and concomitantly isn't interested in the suffrages. So we can begin to build a story about a person who is very concerned about the penitential psalms, possibly reading that intensely over the period of Lent, but has no truck with saints. And that also jives with what we see here in this page with a small miniature showing two female saints that's very, very clean and has almost no register on the graph with a densitometer. But however, here's a person who also is quite interested in indulgences, and at this opening with the Adoro Te and Cruce Pendentum with the Mass of St. Gregory, which is different from a massive St. Gregory, so that's all right, is that we have a large spike there. So here we can begin to build a portrait of somebody who is interested in indulgences, the penitential psalms, but not in saints. And I think what this shows is that in this era, and especially the 15th century, with books of hours that have multiple texts in them, that the reader, him or herself, can choose which texts speak to his or her condition, that we have a greater sense of self, of variety, and we can contrast that with an earlier period with, say, the Psalter, where the Psalter might be read from beginning to end in a continuous way. But now we get people being able to choose what they want to read and when. Now, actually, using a densitometer on a manuscript isn't the only way in which to extract this kind of use-wear activity. Now, as Suzette van Haden will speak about later, the online presence of at least the Berlin parts of this codex, they've created a new presence for the Prayer Book of Mary of Guelders, one that has quite different possibilities than the parchment version does. And by that I mean that the digital images of this book can act in particular ways. We tend to view them one at a time as the online viewer allows us to. That's the default mechanism for leafing through the images, that we can see them one at a time. However, that is not the only possibility, and of course, these digital images can be reconfigured to extract different kinds of information from the book. And that's what I want to talk about. So namely, seeing a group of images like this, tiled thumbnails, literally provides an overview. So viewing them as a group arrayed like this might be termed distant looking. So in contradiction to close looking. What we usually do is close looking as art historians. So here I'm thinking about distant looking. So I'm applying the idea of Franco Moretti, who coined the term distant reading. So this kind of viewing is the opposite of looking for detail in decoration or iconography. But what does an approach like this have to offer? So it shows that some of the leaves are simply darker than others. This one, for example, folio 220, it's quite yellow. Let's take a look at that. A very yellow leaf. But when we look at this folio 220 more closely, it doesn't seem to have been touched or handled in particular, but rather the parchment itself has this yellowish sheen. So I'm therefore not arguing that all discoloration stems from use, but some of this discoloration must come from the vicissitudes of time and also from degradation of materials and from the particularities of the raw materials themselves. Another area of darkness is at folio 410. So let's take a look at that. This is the page that says this book was commissioned by Duchess Mary of Guelders in 1415. And it's the page with the provenance. And I suspect that this dirt may have been deposited by modern manuscript tourists who wanted to see the dated note of ownership and proof of the book's noble provenance. Thus, not all signs of wear reveal devotional fervor, but some of them may be from modern readers. And I think that's especially the case in important manuscripts like the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, where often it's the picture pages that get the most attention from modern manuscript tourists, as I call them. Now, which brings me to the point, which is this kind of dirt analysis is evidence of, but not proof of, use, and it needs to fit into a larger contextual story in order to be useful to us to try to give contour to the past. But looking at sequences of folios laid out like this can also reveal patterns of wear whose most likely explanation was that it was caused by an early user, such as Mary of Guelders. Now, these folios, for example, you can see the dark fingerprints in the series. These are from a sequence in the Hours of the Passion. And when we look at those arrayed, we can flip through them one by one and see, we can imagine the way in which the book was held and extensively read and held and gripped over an extended period of several acts of reading, so that we get fingerprints, very clear fingerprints where grime is ground into the structure and the fibers of the parchment along that axis of the book. So we can get a sense that an early user was reading the Hours of the Passion, for example. Now, taking this kind of overview also reveals that Mary, or early users, spent less time with the suffrages arranged according to the Proprium Sanctorum. But however, I don't think that this necessarily indicates that the user was less interested in saints. Rather, this section, and you'll recognize the Proprium Sanctorum because of all of the miniatures with 3 saints in each. Rather, this section is designed, as you know, so that the saints appear in order of the liturgical calendar that would be read perhaps only once per year. So if Mary had this book commissioned in 1415, and it was made then, and she died in 1427, she might have read this section 12 times, and therefore didn't deposit a lot of grime in these pages. Whereas she might have read the Hours of the Passion every single day quite fervently during either Lent or the week before Easter. Now, so another way to think about how Mary, or an early user, interacted physically with this book is to look at the targeted wear in the Proprium Sanctorum. For example, this image, which we saw earlier, represents St. Lazarus, St. Thomas the Apostle, and Thomas of Canterbury, as Laura Slater talked about earlier. But the central image here has been rubbed extensively. Now, it is, in fact, as you can see here, so it's rubbing and with a kind of motion upward where the face of the figure is stroked and then the stroke goes up into the gold area and then almost into the text. I suspect that one of the reasons for touching the text in this way is that one wants to touch the gold. And I think that's why we often see diaper backgrounds being rubbed extensively, because they have the aesthetics of, I don't know, rubbing corduroy or experiencing the fingerscape of something interesting with contrasting metallic and painted surfaces, the rough and smooth next to each other. And so there's a kind of aesthetics of this touching, but there's also, of course, a devotional reason for it to take place. But some of you may be thinking, is this simply iconoclasm? Because we are, of course, dealing here with a text, a suffrage to St. Thomas of Canterbury. And you could think about the kinds of image destruction that went on, as I'm showing you here at the lower left, where in this Southern Netherlandish Book of Hours full-page miniature with the martyrdom of Thomas of Canterbury at an altar, and he's completely obliterated. And in fact, he's not only been rubbed out with this kind of vigorous movement, but ink has been sort of laid on in order to literally cross him out of existence. But in fact, that kind of iconoclasm primarily took place in England and not in the Low Countries. And iconoclasm is probably not the reason for this damage in the prayer book. Now, a clue to why I don't think it's iconoclasm appears on the next folio at the end of the suffrage to St. Lazarus. Now, the user has smeared the dirty finger. So imagine that the user has taken a wet finger and stroked that central figure, who must represent St. Lazarus, then has a finger full of grime, and then deposits that finger full of grime down at the bottom of the page, as if to make sure that the paint stays where it should in the book. There are lots of examples of users redepositing the paint as if to put it back where it belongs. There's a manuscript in Le Mans, for example, that's full of this sort of thing. Now, the user has smeared the dirty finger as if flipping back and forth between the text and the image. And this way, this is partly an answer to Carl's question or point that he made earlier, why represent the three in a row? It might simply be because three figures fit neatly into a more or less square frame, and it might sort of be an annoyance to have to flip back and forth. But here, clearly, she's interacting with this text and that image. Likewise, this image that shows three saints, Anne, Martha, and Pantaleone, the user again has stroked the middle figure's face, which is Pantaleone's, and brushed upwards, which has caused the paint to really smear right into the text region, to migrate onto the text itself. So we can imagine Mary, or an early user, with a finger full of paint then. And what happens to it? Well, here is the paint on the book, in the image, and then 2 folios later, at the relevant Saint Suffrage, we see it stroked. So we can imagine flipping back and forth to use the book in this very physical way. Now, here is an opening with both targeted and inadvertent wear side by side. The reader has deliberately touched the figure of Mary in especially her blue gown, touching her knees, which is a common kind of thing to go for the feet or the knees as an act of humility, to want to make physical contact with Mary, but to start with the lowest parts of her body, and her knees are pretty safe. The reader has deliberately touched this image, almost boring a hole right down to the parchment, and maybe has used a damp finger to do so, although there's one telling clue that suggests that it wasn't a damp finger, which is that normally if the paint has been liquefied with a damp finger, we would be likely to see more paint. There's just a tiny little drop of paint here that has stuck to the other side. So maybe this is a bit of damp work with a wet finger. But we can also see that this is a page that the owner has turned to many, many times because of the intensity of the fingerprints in multiple places, which suggest holding the book in different ways over multiple acts of reading over a period of weeks, months, or years. Now, I do want to urge caution when applying this kind of thinking, this kind of argument to a book, to try to imagine useware as to re-engineer, reverse engineer the useware, and think about how the book was handled. And this folio, it represents Francis and the two AWOLDs, but and you'll see that there's extensive damage here to the two AWOLDs in particular. And I suspect that that is not really from devotion, because it doesn't conform to the kinds of devotional marks that we've seen before, which involve light stroking and a kind of petting and a kind of gentleness, a kind of wish to make contact. But rather, this kind of damage looks more like an inadvertent spill, something sticky that fell onto the book. Sorry. You can look at the sticky damage for 1 second. So not all damage is, of course, from devotional fervor. Now, when thinking about the question of whether it was Mary or somebody else who wrought all of this damage onto the book, I feel confident in saying that some of the intense devotional wear was from Mary herself. First, because it makes sense in context, considering that on this folio, for example, she'd be making contact with her name saint, the Mother of God. But that Mary was an ardent reader of her own book is also suggested by the great deal of wear that appears on the section of material that now falls at the end of the Berlin Codex. And it would appear that many of the most worn pages are the ones that are least well decorated. So she interacted most heavily with these very sober pages that fall at the end of the book. But that she read these sections aligns with the fact that she bothered to add these texts at all to the book. And of course, we know that she did add these because she included another portrait of herself here. So when a book owner so desires a set of texts or images in a book that she is willing to go to the trouble and expense of taking the book apart, having new editions commissioned, and putting them all back together again, one can logically surmise that those are the texts that she is desperately seeking. And what exactly are all of those added texts? Well, a lot of them are instructions for prayers to be recited in church and while attending Mass. And these are among the most heavily fingerprinted in the whole book. For example, this heavily handled section has rubrics that direct her to read Mass. During Mass, they say, "Speak this after the Sanctus," and one should read this after the raising of the sacrament, for example. So thus, she apparently followed along in her book, reading these sections in Middle Dutch, while the Mass was going along around her in Latin. And so in this way, she became a more intense participant in the goings-on in the altar, having this bilingualism and the Mass on the one hand, and her own devotions with the book simultaneously on the other. In this same section, this very filthy, well-thumbed bit has a prayer to be read during the Mass after the elevation of the host. And we can imagine it from, for example, a manuscript half a century later, the Travoltio Hours, which shows, just to give you a context here, showing the priest elevating the host above his head with his back to the audience, facing the altar. So this is the key moment around which a lot of these heavily thumbed prayers have been written. So Mary of Guelders did not have an image of the elevation of the host in her book, but we could instead imagine Mary of Guelders using this book at Mass, having privileged access to the altar, a little like Blanche of Savoy does in the image of her prayer book which is now in New Haven. So there's one final clue about how an early owner, possibly Mary herself, interacted with the text. And it is that she might have wet touched this initial H. You can see that the blue is completely smeared and that she's wet touched it and then dragged the paint down into the lower margin. And it's interesting that she's used the margin this way rather than stroking it into the text, which would have damaged the text. Now she's going to damage the margin instead. And this must have been a habit, since this is the result of multiple events of stroking over a period of time. But it's interesting to note that the text at this point reads, "Lord, you are a beacon of eternal light." So it's possible that Mary was touching this gold initial at this point in order to signify that light in some way. Now, conversely, this section of prayers, which is also in this end bit of added prayers, is very little handled. Now, these, for example, are the 5 paternosters that I'm showing you, with an indulgence of 100 days granted by Pope Honorius. Here and throughout the Codex, the user was not particularly interested in winning indulgences, that is, time off purgatory. But in this, she was quite exceptional, as there was a mania for indulgences going on all around her, and she was completely ignoring it. But she was, however, interested in the supernatural texts that warded off evil, and had quite a few of those in the original parts of the book. And they're often easy to spot in a book because they're interspersed with red crosses. The form of this kind of text that might be categorized as supernatural incantations involves sort of uttering words interspersed with crosses that often prevent the devil from approaching, prevent drowning in water, prevent being stricken by lightning, and keep all manner of devils at bay. Mary had even more incantations added to the book that are now at the beginning of the Codex in the first few folios, just before the calendar. The offsets of the decoration in the calendar are stuck to these incantations, which suggests that this might be the original location for them. Let's take a closer look at them, and we can see in the text I've highlighted here in yellow that this particular passage invokes the 3 magi, the names Jaspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. And uttering their names was strong medicine. And we can tell from other manuscripts as well that invoking their names, both as words and as images, might have had a strong apotropaic effect. So, for example, that supernatural potency appears in this 13th century Bible that's now in Philadelphia. And what's really odd about this manuscript is that a 14th century artist, so just a few years after it was made, added these marginal paintings in the book of Luke with the 3 magi seeing the star, visiting the Virgin and Child, and then sleeping and having the angel come and visit them. But what you'll no doubt have noticed is that the faces of the 3 magi have been deliberately targeted. Possibly, somebody added these images simply to rub them out again for apotropaic reasons. But this is something that we can see across a wide spectrum of manuscripts, including this Delft Book of Hours, which again has the faces of the 3 magi rubbed out. And it's thought that because the magi could walk in a straight line, that they could be invoked for people with mobility problems who might also want to wear a ring like this one in order to keep the images of the 3 magi close to their bodies at all times. So this is the kind of thing that is then worked into the apotropaic text at the beginning of Mary's prayer book. The next part of this incantation is Jesus autem transiens per illorum ebat. This was a phrase that travelers used in order to ward off perils of the unknown. And we know from John of Mandeville in his fictional Pilgrim's account that he writes about this text. He says, I quote, A half a mile from Nazareth is the leap that our Lord leaped from the Jews when they led him upon a high rock to cast him down and slay him, but he passed through them and leapt to another rock where his steps can still be seen. And therefore, some men say, when they have dread of thieves, this verse written here, Jesus autem transiens per allorem ebat. So in other words, this is a text that is uttered at a moment of peril in order to escape trouble. And sometimes this text is also written on rings. We see this combination of text appear on all kinds of rolls that have apotropaic benefits as well, always interspersed with crosses, or in this Southern Netherlandish prayer book, alongside St. George, one of the preeminent protective saints, where this formula appears again together with St. George. So very popular apotropaic texts that Mary has put in her book. So in the end, the prayers that Mary of Guelders added to her book are those that relate to using the book during Mass and to turning the book into an apotropaic object, one that would ward off death and evil and difficulty. In adding these apotropaic texts to her book, she was reinforcing the function of the book as a spiritual shield. The added texts reveal what she considered to be most important but sorely missing. They're very essential but worth hauling the book apart in order to add. So in my talk, I've suggested that Mary used her prayer book vigorously, especially interacting with selected saints and selected texts such as the Hours of the Passion, and using it to touch vigorously certain images, such as the image of the Virgin and Child. Now, over time, of course, the function of the book would have changed. So at first, it was primarily a vehicle for devotions, and then it became a repository for new prayers and images that weren't included in the first round in 1415. And after the death of the Duchess, it took on a new role as an heirloom of the family's glory, wealth, and taste. Later, as a museum object, the devotional texts would have become much less important, as they were merely a substrate for the collection of very prized miniatures to swim in. The religious messages of the manuscript then faded into obscurity, since only people with paleographical training could decipher the words. These functions, therefore, are in a balance, that the more it is an aesthetic object whose miniatures are prized for their craftsmanship, the less it is a devotional manual, and the less grubby its folios are allowed to become. Thanks.